Well, I was going to say that I was born in Lusk in 1917, and I have a vivid recollection of the village and the parish for the last 70 years. Lusk is a totally different place now towards that particular area where we had no electric light, no sewage and no water except the village pump. And it bears little resemblance to the village we know today, or to the parish we know today. The occupational background of Lusk was mixed farming. There were some very excellent farmers there with an emphasis on beef production. In those days there was a great beef trade with England, and it was not unusual to see thousands of cattle every Thursday at the Dublin market going down the North Circular Road to the boats for England. And the Lusk area produced its maximum of that type of business. You had very excellent farmers, and if you start from the Dublin Road into Lusk, you had the Morgans, the Taylors, Thomas Murtha, the Clintons. Up the road then you had Sweetman's, and back up the other way McNally's, Peter McNally, the Jenkinsons, and then up the green where you had smaller farmers, but they wouldn't be so deep in the beef business. Well, then, to give you an idea of how extensive it was, if you go out to the east side of the parish, you had the Rooneys of Rathini and the Bells of Horstone and the Clintons. And back to the west side, we had the Maguires and the Hoys, and over towards the Five Roads, you had the Monkses at the Nevitt, the Boylans, the Moores, the Earleys. A lot of people wouldn't remember the Earleys, but that was where Willie Moore farmed, as distinct from Tommy Moore. And if you come up the road then, on up towards Balloch, you had the Purfield farm, which is now owned by the Hartfords. Further on you had the Healy's and the McGraths. And on up through Carduff you had the Maxwells and the Arnolds, and further afield the Hone estate, and so on. Now, most of these farm places kept certainly one, but 2 or 3 workmen, agricultural workers, permanently, not on a casual basis. And we as young fellows got to know, what workmen were attached to what farm. You'd know who they worked for. And it was very thriving, I must say, and there seemed to be a great stir about. I well remember the fun. There was a famous buyer from England just come over around January, after Christmas anyway, January and February, to buy the stall feds. These were the cattle that were fed in the stalls. And a great amount of the agricultural worker farmers was producing food, oats, turnips, hay, etc., to produce these stall feds. And they made a lot of money, 30 and 40 pounds, which was a great lump of money then, in those days. And there would be a real rodeo when this buyer, whose name was Story, I remember it, some of the elders would remember Story, he would come over from England with his aides, and he would buy a trainload of cattle. Now, these cattle would be let out on the roads, very little cars then, very little traffic, to go to the railway station in Lusk. And as we as young fellows would have great fun banging the cattle and loading them into the wagons, and it seemed to be a great day's work. There could be up to 150 to 100 stall feds, and then the same would happen again in February. Now, the smaller men in the parish, they concentrated on rearing the stores, the calves and stores, which subsequently were bought by the fatteners to go into the stalls. There seemed to be very little. I remember the village square well. It was a very attractive place, and there were eaved, thatched houses there, and there were big stones at the bottom of these, where the elders, senior citizens, used to gather, sit there, 6 or 7 of them. There were famous characters like Bill Sherry, the Yank Gray, Jimmy Flanagan, the 60 Smith, Bill Gray, and various people like that who would sit down and while away the morning or the afternoon talking or smoking. They were elder, of course. Well, then we had 2 tailors in Lusk. Mickey Cruce was one, and the other was Jem, not Jimmy or James, Jem Donnelly. And Jem had it was a funny old fellow who had a long beard coming down, and he had a famous wife, Leisha Donnelly, and Leisha was a very hard sort of woman, and had her own particular edge on life. But Jem, when he'd be finished sitting on his tailor's board, tailor's whatever they call it, would step down about 5 o'clock in the afternoon and just rambled. He was on the station road, just a few. When I say station road, I mean only a few roads up, opposite the Hill House. And I forgot to mention Murtagh's of the Hill House in the farming and cattle production. But he'd ramble up to Murray's, have a couple of bottles of stout. But this particular evening, he seemed to have had one over the two. It was a very warm evening, sunny evening somewhere, and he went over to the stones, as we call them, and he sat down, and before long he fell asleep. And some of the good boys came along with the scissors, and they cut half the beard off of him. And he didn't realise this. And he went home to Leisha. She threw a fit, and she came up to the corner, as we call it, to know who did this on Jem, and there was a great ructions. So I think he had to cut the other half off to measure it and let it grow again. There was good fun there. Then that was the collecting place for the village, where people of all ages and all, more or less all classes, gathered there, particularly at the weekend, just to chat and talk and go over accounts of the week and the various happenings, because there was very little other ways, there were very little other occupations. Hurling was the chief occupation in Lusk. They hurled and hurled and hurled. And their skills weren't great. They thought as long as they were pulling hard, they were hurling well. And I suppose they might have been frightening and intimidating to opposing teams. But their standards weren't very good. They won the junior championship. I remember, historically speaking now, I don't remember this, of course, they won the County Dublin Junior Championship in 1910. They won the Fingal League in 1926, whatever kind of a league that was. But they also won the Junior Championship in 1932. Junior League, I should say, in 1932. Junior Championship in 1933. An Intermediate Championship in 1934.
Now, stop there. Go through that again, as if you were starting.
Yeah.
Just put a marker on the film. Yeah.
About the hurling.
Yeah.
They won the Junior Championship in 1910. The Fingal League in 1926, and the Junior Championship again in 1933. They had won the league in 1932, and the Intermediate Championship in 1934. And they then went to play senior, but it was impossible to play senior, a village team to play senior, because the senior hurling in Dublin at that time was comprised of the best hurlers in Ireland, who played for University College and Fogs and Commercials and all these teams that were brought up from the country to play with them. Well, they also won the hurling championship in 1951 and the Intermediate League in 1952. So you can see where there's a connection, 10 years space. Unfortunately, it's died out now because hurling had become too expensive. And in the modern era, there were too many easy ways of entertaining one without getting fingers broken and blood spilled here and there. So there were characters then. You see, I'll go back first of all to talk about the beef and how the cattle trade was so great with England and how it collapsed.
Okay, well, let's take the beef as a separate entity. Just mark it.
The beef, the great beef trade in England, gradually evaporated towards the 30s. Why? Because we here in Ireland were paying land annuities to England. That was part of the treaty arrangements with the British in the 1920s, whatever went on, the negotiations went on at that time. We paid land annuities, which was immoral and wrong. And De Valera decided, when he came to power in 1932, that one of the first acts he did was refuse to pay these annuities. Well, that was all very fine as things went, but the English government then said, oh, very well, thank you very much, but we'll settle that with you. And they put huge impositions of tax on our cattle going into English ports. And the result was that in order to recoup their £15 million, I think it was, per year we paid in land annuities, I'm not quite sure of that, but I think it was about £15 million, The price of cattle dropped from the average of going to England 30 to 40 pounds to £6 and £7. And worse than that, you had to have a license to export so many cattle. And farmers suffered a terrible loss, and there was a terrible decline in agriculture at the time because we hadn't developed as a corn producing country. We had only grown oats and maybe a bit of barley, very, very little wheat. And it changed then. There were no tractors then, by the way, none at all. And each of those farms that I spoke of would have at least 2 horses, and some of them 3. And we also, as kids, knew what horses belonged to what farms, whether by their colour or by who was driving them or what. Now, the whole farming scene changed then, and we had to gradually get back into mixed farming. A limited amount of potatoes and vegetables, because that type of business was carried on by the farmers in Rush. They had the good soil, the sandy soil, and they could get 2 or 3 crops per year out of the soil. And what built the farmers in Rush up was the advent of the ton truck. Heretofore they had to go with their horse and carts to the Dublin market and bring home a load of manure, which would take all day, and they weren't able to work any more than 2 or 3 days per week on the farm. Now the ton truck meant that they could run in with their produce at 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning and be back by 8 or 10. And they became very wealthy, and they began to look for land, and some of the poor farmers who weren't doing well in Lusk were very glad to let them their land. Now, another production in the agricultural line was haymaking. Rush, you see, as I say, there were no tractors, but they had numerous horses, and they would come into Lusk at the haymaking period to buy hay. That helped out to a certain degree, and it was profitable. Now, there were some characters knocking round at the time after the First World War. You see, many people, I should say first of all that the background, the employment background for many who didn't find employment on the farms was the Remount Farm at Lusk, which was a British cavalry training school. And a lot of young fellows went in there as grooms or attendants or labourers or that. We, after the treaty, kept on this training school, cavalry training school, for a while, but it gradually closed down, and it's there still, but it's now let out and land given out to people in land. And some of the characters were Hughie Collins. I remember one famous character after the war, the Budget Moore. The Budget had spent, he was from Carduff, he had spent 4 years in the trenches, not on the sideline, but in the trenches, and his stories were consistent, and they were a revelation. You couldn't read any book that would describe trench warfare as well as the Budget would describe it, especially when he had a few jars, and that was almost eternally. Some of the stories that the Budget Moore would recount would be almost unbelievable until you had heard them again and again and again, and they never faltered in their storytelling.
Can you tell us any stories
of the Budget? Well, he described one time they found out in the trench warfare that if you could get back to hospital, you could have great relief, and the surest way to get back to hospital without being shot, of course, was to get frostbite. So they took off their boots in the old trenches, and they wetted their feet and all the rest of it and held them out to the frost. The Budget wasn't so lucky. He described it one time saying, "Jesus, I think mine got hotter." His feet got hotter, he didn't get back. There was another occasion when he was returning from one of these over-the-top attacks and getting back, and here a shell exploded and killed a German soldier. No. First of all, I should say he picked up this injured German soldier and carried him to the edge of the trench, and he just left him down till he would get into the trench himself and pull him in, when a shell came and blew him up right in front of his eyes. Budget also sustained injuries in the head, and he had a steel plate for which he drew a pension to the end of his days. I remember at one time drawing his pension, it was 16 shillings. And as he came out of the local post office, it fell on the ground, and I helped him to pick it up. And he said, yes, I never had so much money in my life. 16 shillings. That was the famous budget. And there was an old fellow named Rogers in Carduff who had served in India. And he was an old reprobate going about. But he brought you into the house and showed him pictures of himself in the white uniform out in India. And he was a remarkably different man. Lots of people like that. I often think when you see the crowds in public houses now, you take Balloch, for instance, the public house in Balloch. Well, there'd be nobody there, just a few old fellows who'd come up to drink at night, and maybe a few in the daytime, maybe a few passers. And when you compare that with the crowds that are there now, it's unbelievable. It's hard to imagine. Now, is there anything else I should talk about?
That was excellent.
I just turned this off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just give you the go. 1 second.
Well, earlier on I was talking about...
No, to just start off and just don't mind what you were
yeah.
talking about earlier on. It may not be in the sequence
Right.
you're saying.
Well, Dan, am I right? Well, Dan Sherry brought me to school in Lusk. He's a young fella. He was the one that brought me. And my fellow school pals at that stage, as in the senior classes, were Paddy Cruce, Kit Russell, Jack Brown, and Mick Seaver. Now, they're the only ones that are alive. And strangely enough, Joe Carton, who's one of the senior citizens of Lusk and can be seen sunning himself nearly every day down in the square, he, for one reason or other, went to Carduff. I'm not sure why. But the first schoolmaster was Mr. Devine, generally known as Old Tom, and he was a great educationalist, but I'm afraid he got very little cooperation from students. He was getting old and he was contrary, and he was beginning to introduce Irish in a big way as our national language, and we didn't fall for it too easily. Then Larry Dunn came along. Now, Larry had been a schoolmaster in Dublin before he came out to Lusk National School, where he was principal, and his method of teaching was quite revolutionary for us as we're concerned, because he taught on the basis that naturally they taught in Dublin schools, and this was absolutely new as far as we were concerned, and it took us a long time to fall in with that. But he was very good, and exercised a lot of control in a way that old Devine couldn't control. And in those days too, you see, Irish became a compulsory subject. They were trying to reintroduce, I suppose, our nationalism. And if you wanted to be nationalistic, naturally you had to have a language, and the department then...
So, could I... You see, one of the things you're not giving us is the period.
Yeah.
If you could go back and say in
1922, yeah.
About the school, and I'll just mark it again. Because, you see, you could be talking about any period of
Yeah.
time.
Now, I'm talking about the period now, 1922 and afterwards, when we got our free state and our own departments, the Department of Education, and to typify or to develop nationalism, they had to develop a national language, and Irish became a compulsory language. Now, most of us didn't know Irish. It was practiced by old Gaelic classes, much on the same basis as the whole hedge schools in Ireland, and naturally that wasn't enough. The language was there all right, but wasn't generally spoken, and the department then insisted on, in the curriculum, of Irish being a compulsory subject. Now, it was hard, it was difficult, particularly for those of us who had no background and didn't know it, and many is the fellow whose hands were sore after his lessons in Irish. But it picked up, and it has now developed wonderfully well, and there are thousands of Irish native speakers, and all of us, I think, have a little gibberish of Irish with us, and that's good. There were no scholarships that I remember of then, and most fellas, very few fellas as a matter of fact, went to Dublin schools or went on for secondary education. Now almost every lad goes to secondary and third level education, but in those days very few did. And I remember well going to school, secondary school in Dublin, and feeling very lonely and almost frightened until we began to meet the odd fellow who was from North County Dublin, and we developed tremendous rapport which lasted for the rest of our lives.
Nice.
The method of farming then and now bears very little comparison. In the olden days, that's the days I talk about, around the 20s and 30s, farmers had to till the land with horses and had to produce the manure to make the land useful. You see, there were no artificial manures then, and therefore production was controlled mainly by the amount of manure was available to a man. This came from the cattle sheds mainly. Fellows from Rush who had no cattle because they had no grassland had to draw the manures from Dublin, but here in Lusk we had plenty of manure, and goodness knows the cleaning out of sheds and the building up of banks of manure and then the transporting of that onto the land became a great occupational effort. And there was a lot of poverty. The wages of the agricultural labour at that time was 15 shillings a week as far as I remember, and I well remember it going to £1 a week. Of course money was money then, but just the same I often wondered, no matter how values changed, how a man reared 2, 3, 4 and 5, there were big families, but even 3s and 4s on 15 shillings a week to feed them and to buy clothes. It's unimaginable, it's simply unimaginable. Well, they went out and they tilled this land. It took a long time then, you see, to plough an acre of land. And I suppose the average farmer, and I'm talking about the big farmer, would have 20 acres of land. And that took a lot of ploughing, and it took a lot of tedious harrowing and drilling and work, so that they were occupied the whole year round working the land. Now that has changed with the introduction of the tractor, when you can go out and plough 5, 6, 8, 10 acres a day and develop it, and they've all possible machinery nowadays for doing anything that's necessary on land. The opening of drills and planting of crops and lifting of crops and lifting of potatoes, that has become a completely commercial exercise. I often joke my sons about the fact that they don't have to use muscles at all now. They've only to press electric buttons or tractor buttons and everything happens for them. Of course that takes its toll too. They have to work long hours, but the production became tremendous, and that incidentally was one of the reasons why trade lessened considerably between Ireland and England. Ireland were very poor. England was a very poor producer for itself, and they imported, I suppose, 80% of their food. Well, with the war, they found that it was necessary to increase this production, and with the aids and artificial manures, their production came up to such an extent that they are now almost self-sufficient. A little short in meats and lambs and all that kind of thing, but they have developed tremendously. Even the glasshouse business and all, they're overproduced. England is now selling lambs and cattle on the French market, whereas one time they were total importers, and that of course affected the Irish trade. The EEC, I believe, was a blessing as far as Ireland was concerned, because we have outlets now through Europe for our stock, and very, very small amounts of it go to England. And Scotland was a great area also for the sale of store cattle, where we would sell them as stores, 10, 12 hundredweight, and they would fatten them themselves. And they appreciated the Irish store trade very much. Gone again, run out again.
Very good.
Any other stories?
You haven't worn out. Tommy, would you like a nice cup of tea while I go and put the kettle on?
Well, if you don't mind, no, I'm going over to the glass houses now.
Okay,
Yeah,
fine.
yeah.
Let's see, is there any more stories?
What are you growing in the glass houses?
Tomatoes. We grow tomatoes.
And is there a big trade?
It's not a big trade, but there's a passing trade, and we don't export them, but the Dublin market takes and gets rid of most of the tomatoes we produce here, whether to north of Ireland or to the country, down to the west of Ireland and south of Ireland. The truckers bring these down.
How would you say the market has changed with regard to Rush? Like, are you competing with Rush, with your better soil, which is your neighbour? Actually, Rush at one stage was part of Lusk.
Yeah. You want me to talk? Have you it on?
Yeah.
The farming in Rush and Lusk were two different types. The Rush men had good early sandy soil, and they could get early potatoes in and did them very well, and all kinds of vegetables. They were great men to grow vegetables. And their development came remarkably with the buildings in Dublin. Now, they always had this business, but if you take Griffith Avenue and Merrion and all these places, they were the market gardens of Dublin long ago. And they were suddenly sold for development and building, all up Upper Drumcondra, Griffith Avenue particularly, and on the south side, the Merrion areas and all the rest of it. That left an open space, if you like, in the market for the vegetable producers of Rush. Now, the Lusk people didn't go in much for vegetables because the land was heavy there, and it didn't respond to vegetable production, especially without the artificial manure. And consequently, there were two different types of farming. As I said in the beginning, the farming in Lusk was mixed farming with an emphasis on beef production and lamb production and all the rest of it. But they couldn't do that in Rush at all because they had no areas of grassland, and therefore cattle were unknown in Rush, so were sheep and that kind of thing. And they were entirely tillers of the soil, if you like, and excellent vegetable growers. Development in the Rush area of glass, because they found that tomatoes were I couldn't say easily produced, they need an awful lot of attention, but they were rewarding, and the return was pretty good. They also grew cucumbers and lettuce and things like that, and it spread a little bit to the Lusk area, but not to the extent that it was in Rush. But I noticed that now a lot of these glass houses are disappearing, because, first of all, the trade wasn't as bright as it was in the earlier days, and the sites made a lot of money for building. A lot of the tomato sites were sold for house building, and the development, I think, of the agricultural scene in Rush has deteriorated to some extent. They don't produce as much as they used. They're early potato men and cauliflower men and that kind of thing. But again, it needs the tractors, and it needs big production to keep these big lorries on the road sending the material in and out to Dublin. But I couldn't say that glass house business is developing. If anything, I think it's less than it had been.